Hey everyone, it's been a while. I hope you're all doing well. A couple highlights in this video from the readings of the last few weeks, and especially on your own comments and questions that you've been putting in your excellent posts. I want to highlight just a couple things here. I want to start with a brief quote from Caswell. She wrote the the Everyday Algorithms article. I should have warned you, this piece has a lot of great ideas kind of drowning in a sea of boringness. It's a very straightforward article, kind of low energy, but a lot of really great formulations there. And so there's just one in particular I want to highlight that we need to keep in mind throughout the second half of the class, and especially as you're kind of bringing everything together in the last couple weeks. Algorithms cannot be studied adequately as standalone processes. If we want to understand them, we have to think of them as technical infrastructure. And I really like this idea, thinking about algorithms as technical infrastructure, something that's kind of around us every day, but also as cultural artifacts that are part of a generative process. And she compares them to sort of ecosystems and surrounding ecosystems. And I think this is super important because if we just think about, are algorithms biased, or can they be misleading, or can they be wrong? Sure. You didn't need this class to learn that. But when we start thinking about algorithms sort of as embedded systems in a whole sort of ecosystem of complex systems and how they interact and how they don't, I think the problem's a lot more interesting when you think of it that way, instead of maybe this formula is wrong. Maybe we're computing this person's score inappropriately. I mean, those are important questions too. But when you think about algorithms and all the ways we're reading about them, but as an ecosystem, and thinking about sort of how algorithms get generated throughout a long and very much a historical process, I think this gives us some new insights. So I'll get back to that in a second. So those are the two things in the one passage I want to call your attention to. Algorithms as infrastructure, kind of like streets, they're there, they dictate where we can go and where we can't. And number two, situated artifacts, cultural artifacts that influence sort of what's going on, that we create and we constantly modify. Unlike streets, which kind of get built and stay there, cultural artifacts are always coming and going out of fashion and affecting sort of how people create more stuff. Okay, so take a broad view of algorithms. That's what this article really was meant to do. And I think many of you are already doing that in your posts, but I wanted to make sure you knew that I thought it was really important. Take a broad view. It's not that the algorithms are necessarily biased. We see that in the articles. It's very easy for that kind of thinking and that kind of description to creep in. But it's not just about biased algorithms. It's about biased infrastructure, structural inequalities. It's the bias that creates the ecosystem, giving the data that it does that gets reinforced via the algorithms. And that's where a lot of these interesting issues are. Is how do we address that? It's not how do we fix an algorithm. It's how do we fix or remedy the ecosystem that has created the algorithm and continues to sort of refine it. So one concept from Eubanks, the Digital Poorhouse article, I didn't see much mentioned in your responses that I think is crucial to keep in mind here, is that a concept she talks about. It's not her own idea, but she, I think, describes it very well. It's called rational discrimination. And it's one of the ways I think we can understand how algorithms sort of might malfunction in the way that they do. It's not because of the algorithm, it's not because of the people who created them, and so on. Rational discrimination, she writes, does not require class or racial hatred. And it doesn't even require unconscious bias. It requires only ignoring bias that already exists. When automated decision-making tools are not built to explicitly dismantle structural inequalities, their increased speed and scale of the algorithms intensify these inequalities. And I think this is a different formulation of some of the sort of problems with algorithms that we've been reading about, which tend to focus on sort of obvious structural biases, pointing out that unless they're meant to sort of counteract some of the issues, they're going to simply increase them at a much higher rate than they've been sort of propagated in the past. And I think that's a different kind of danger than just worrying about whether algorithms are sort of perpetuating a bias, but actually making it worse, actively worse, as the scale and speed of data and algorithms and algorithmic decision making increase. And to me, this is really what the Poorhouse the digital poorhouse that she's describing. That's what it's really about. It's not just being governed by algorithms. That was the focus of the Danaher article. But the fact that there's less accountability about it, and less accountability about sort of how it interfaces with existing social inequalities, because there's no accountability when that happens, right? We can recognize it's happened, but who do you point to? You can say the algorithm's wrong, you say the company's bad, the government's not paying attention. So what do you do in that case? But understanding that the scale and speed is a fundamentally different thing than simply the kinds of inequalities that we're all used to reading about historically, that there's a different kind of thing to study and think about here. More on accountability in a few minutes. The last article I want to mention is the Danaher article, which gets into the philosophical weeds, if you didn't notice. Actually, you could probably say it doesn't get out of the philosophical weeds and just kind of lurks there for the entire time. I debated whether or not even to assign this, because it's a slog for sure, and it goes into some technicalities that just really don't matter for our purposes. But there's so many good ideas, I thought it was worth wading through. He argues that we should, weigh the risks and benefits of algocracy, as he puts it, as the mechanisms that make it possible become more ubiquitous. There's two main concepts in his article that I think are worth pointing out. One is the idea of invisible barbed wire. So we have the digital poorhouse, which works for Eubanks' formulation. But the invisible barbed wire, I think, is a really great metaphor, because it's really true. Like, there's this invisible barbed wire fence around what we can do in our lives because of algorithms. But we can't see it. We think there's this infinite horizon out there. We can go wherever we want. We don't really notice the barbed wire until we hit it. And then it's really painful. And sometimes it's hard to get out of it. And then you don't even know where it is, even when you run into it. You don't know where the boundaries are. And it's very effective at keeping people in, keeping people within the boundaries of what the creators of the algorithm want those boundaries to be. And this is a different sort of angle of, when you think about actual barbed wire, which completely transformed the agricultural landscape everywhere, well, fences in general, but especially barbed wire, they make a very clear and distinct impact on what happens in that, well, in geographical space, if you're talking about a real barbed wire fence. But sort of in a social space, there are very real limitations on what people can and can't do, not just because of algorithms, but because of any social structure. When you think about how much power that invisible barbed wire via algorithms has at the hands of very few people or committees or corporations that are creating these and enacting their vision of the world, like a farmer envisions what his land is going to be used for and puts barbed wire to keep animals over here, over there, and moving this way. People do that with the social structures too, but it's very few people controlling a huge number of other people with very little transparency and very little accountability. So those terms will come back later. Another idea in Danaher, this is the second of the two, he talks about the legitimacy of the public decision-making process. And I think this is super interesting, because when we think about algorithms, we don't necessarily think about and the problems or the challenges with algorithms. We don't think about legitimacy very much. We might think about authority. We might think about other things that you've been reading about, but legitimacy. Can we really respect and uphold decisions made by an algorithm rather than elected officials, say? It's a really interesting question. So Danaher is really interested philosophically, sort of from a philosophical ethics kind of standpoint, about the morality and legitimacy. And the reason these are important, he doesn't really talk about it, but I think it's interesting to note that the reason that algorithms need legitimacy is for the same reason government does. And they get their authority through similar, or should get their authority through similar processes. We elect officials to do things for us and make decisions for us. We don't elect algorithms, right? We elect people to maybe govern algorithms. We might elect people to create them in a certain way, but once they go out in the world, they're you can't fire them, right? You can't recall them. You can't vote someone else in. They're there, and they're effective for a long time. And how they get tweaked or modified or remediated is unclear. That creates a different kind of legitimacy about social control than we would have in the typical sort of analog world that we used to live. So algocracy, that's obviously his neologisms for the world in which we're going to live, governed by algorithms. What should we do about it? in his article, it's not really a fear-mongering article, but you can see across the readings we've had over the last few weeks, there is some kind of concern, like some palpable, like, what are we doing? Something's wrong. A lot of your questions in your post talked about this. What should we do? What should we do? It's seen as kind of a threat. In terms of algocracy, that's obviously Danaher's sort of neologism for an algorithmic governed world. How should we think about it? What should we do about it? You can discard the term. I'm not particularly wet about it, but it does call to mind, I think, one particular sort of relationship. Algocracy reminds me a lot of literacy. Not just because the last three letters are the same, but this idea of algocracy as a condition in which we're living that isn't necessarily a choice. It's hard to find people nowadays that would argue literacy is bad. But in fact, when we go back to sort of ancient Greek philosophy, as we always should, Plato, in some of his Socratic dialogue, talks about literacy as a pharmakon. And pharmakon is the Greek word for drug, and it has this deliberately ambivalent definition to it, which is good and bad. Just like we think of drug users as kind of bad, and we think of drug stores as good. So we're comfortable with this ambiguity of drug as acting both as a medicine and as a poison, on the other hand. Literacy, as Plato describes, is a pharmakon because it's good in the sense that we get the freedom to forget. We can write things down and not have to worry about reminding ourselves constantly. That's a tremendous change in the way people think and interact with the world. You could write something down and come back to it. The document becomes an authority. It has a legitimacy to it. If something is written down, even now, we think of this as a little bit more, we talked about this in the archive section of the class, it becomes a little bit more authoritative than something that's just said and more ephemeral. But he calls literacy a pharmakon because there's that good side, there's the medicine side, but there's also the poison side because it means that we think differently and we don't listen as well. We don't remember as well. And the idea of memory as an important part of civic society, that's kind of the sort of theme of the dialogue, is how should people act, what should they be doing, how should they work together. If all you have, if the most important thing are documents and people can read them or can't read them, that's very different than people who can participate in a society via spoken word and speeches and things like that. Now, it's not that one is necessarily better than the other. It's just that there's pros and cons to literacy. That was his point. There's not a question of whether you're going to have literacy or not. That ship sailed, right? And he well recognized that. But he wanted to understand and think of literacy as a pharmakon, as both good and bad. And I think that's the best way, contra Danaher, who's very pessimistic about it. I think that's the best way to think about sort of an algocracy. I think at this point it's actually interesting to reflect on what we think algorithms really are, or what they are not, and how they're different from sort of related kinds of things. Natalie asks an interesting question about whether I agree with Sutherland's definition of algorithms as a set of guidelines that describe how to perform a task. And I don't agree with that at all. And Wilson, in an earlier article, talked about an algorithm as a recipe, and another sort of set of instructions to follow. Algorithms, in a sense, are certainly guidelines to perform a task, but there's two key things about algorithms that really aren't necessarily part of that just set of instructions kind of definition. One, there's inputs to an algorithm and there's an output. That's, to me, central to the definition of what an algorithm is. You have to give it some information, something happens, there's some sort of transformation, and then you get something out. You might get the same thing you put in. Like if the algorithm is multiply something by 0, it doesn't matter what you put in, you're going to get 0 out. You can put in 0, you're going to get 0 out. Things don't have to change, but there's an input and there's an output. That's one key aspect of algorithms in my mind. Another one is that there's a decision-making process that has to be part of an algorithm that really differentiates it from a set of instructions. And it's a fine line. Let's take example of baking cookies, because everything in my life revolves around food. You can think of a recipe as an algorithm. It's a set of instructions. Take these ingredients, mix them, or find the right amounts, find the right ratios, put them together, mix them up, put a certain amount on a cookie sheet, put that in the oven. 30 minutes later, take it out and you've got cookies. Okay, you got an input, raw materials, you got an output, cookies. Great, everyone loves cookies, except maybe with browsers, not the same thing. One of the keywords we talked about earlier. So a set of instructions can be seen as an algorithm, but I think there has to be more to it. But when you think about the decision-making process that goes into making a recipe, that's where I think it can become more algorithmic, because you're constantly reevaluating the inputs you get based on new inputs that are coming in. You're looking at the cookies sort of as they're baking and maybe making a decision about it, or as you're mixing it. But that's part of the algorithm, is to take in new information or reevaluate your original information and see what's different, and then sort of make decisions. To me, that's where a recipe becomes more algorithmic, right? One thing that's weird about modern recipes is that we measure things out so carefully, like to the gram even, which is not a lot of weight, or an eighth of a teaspoon, or even a quarter teaspoon. Really small amounts of stuff, but then we give really vague instructions like stir until mixed. Well, exactly how mixed is mixed? Reduce until thickened. Thickened. What does thickened mean? Who knows? Bake cookies until they're brown. Well, how brown? There's a little brown. Are they done? Or like, do you want them about to be on fire? Like, that's a different kind of brown. Isn't that weird that recipes do that? But it's part of the challenge. I'm not mentioning this because I'm food crazy, but because it embodies the challenges of the algorithm. Right? Algorithms that are deciding, people's, parole terms or mortgage rates, they're using the same kinds of decision-making processes, taking in a lot of inputs and sort of reevaluating things, and there's a huge decision tree built into an algorithm, right? And the decision tree has to make sort of almost judgments about things in very discrete ways, because that's how computers work, right? So I don't think a recipe is a straightforward example of an algorithm, because there's typically not a lot of decision making that goes into it. Certainly you can have recipes that don't really have much decision making, right? We call them foolproof recipes. You don't have to think, you just follow the directions, and supposedly it turns out. Rarely does it happen. But when you have something in the recipe that says bake until brown, and you have to determine what that means, then I think it's more of an algorithm, because you're changing what's happening. You're changing the set of the instructions that you need to follow based on the inputs, based on how you're processing something. Can we apply, is it appropriate to extend the meaning of algorithm to non-digital situations? Another related question from Natalie. And I think, yeah, you can. There's two concerns with doing that. So and I think they're really useful, and they overlap perfectly with what we saw in the film example. So one way in which analog, as in the case of film development, and digital algorithms, one issue they share in common: calibration. What is the range of values coming in? Every algorithm has inputs, right? But it also has a range of inputs that it deems acceptable, and it's not built to function if you don't give it stuff in that range. What is considered normative? What is considered average, right? These all require sort of baselines that are sort of coded into the algorithm, right? Whether it's an analog process or a digital one, there has to be some sort of calibration. So when the instructions say bake until brown, there has to be some sort of definition baked into the algorithm itself to decide, well, I'm going to look at this thing and sort of use some color spectrum meter to determine what level of brownness it is, and then I'll know when to take it out. That has to be built in, otherwise the algorithm can't work. So what do you decide is brown, right? And this is exactly the issue we saw with film. It wasn't that people didn't know how to calculate different chemical ratios or different timing to develop film in different ways. They made a choice of how the film and the development process was going to be calibrated, right? Now you can see that as a kind of racism, but there's also a pretty straightforward capitalist logic at work too. The film was designed primarily for white people. That was the consumer market. That was the target audience. Now you can say that was wrong and they shouldn't have done that, but that's what they decided. These are the people who are going to buy it. So of course they want the white people who are going to spend money to look, good and make them want to spend money on this thing. And it was that consumer pressure, right, to make the chocolate and the dark furniture look better that changed the process or changed the way sort of stuff was presented as a final product, right? It wasn't a technical issue. It wasn't some moral decision. It was a market decision. All of these sort of these kinds of calibration issues, these are analog examples, the cookies and the film, but they apply to the same way in the digital context as well. One issue that's very different about sort of analog and digital algorithms, we saw this back in the Wilson article, scale and complexity. Now, having a broader range of input values, having a lot more data at your disposal can, in some ways, reduce calibration issues because you've got more stuff, you've got wider sampling. That's generally a good thing. But there still has to be a normative and acceptive range, right? So that the problem doesn't go away. But because of the greater scale, they get sort of a greater aura, I think, of objectivity. And as Bobby put it in his very elegant post, I thought, from last week, when they are layered one upon another millions of times over, these data switches take on an ambience of intellect, authority, and even piety. And I don't know about piety, but certainly objectivity in the sense that we feel an obligation to follow the algorithm because it's supposedly, getting rid of some of human biases. Bobby also made the interesting observation about a shift in course content. We were, in the archive section, focused more about the content, what was being saved, how was it being cataloged, who was being included or excluded. And now we're focused more on how that content is being used, or it being executed in some kind of algorithmic way. I think this is a really interesting observation to make. I hadn't thought about it that way, but I agree. At the same time, I would say many of the problems, if not all the problems that we discussed in terms of archives, that are really understandable in terms of the problems of the collection and really bringing lots of different voices and worldviews, epistemologies, ontologies, remember that stuff? Bringing them into the archive, those things still exist and maybe are even more important in terms of data. So we are now focused on the use of the data, how it gets implemented in algorithms and the effects that people feel in terms of those algorithms. But those issues from collection are still very important. We'll talk about that more over the next couple of weeks as we sort of bring things together. And part of the goal of the class as a whole is to show how these are two sides of the same coin, right? The collection problems and then the use problems. We sort of hinted at the use problems in the archive section, and we're really seeing them now in more specific ways. But I wanted to highlight how that was a great observation. But at the same time, that's part of the conceit of the class, is that there's these two different sort of ways of thinking about things that really are meant to show you how it's kind of this big yin-yang thing that everything relates to everything else. Bobby also perfectly captured the chicken-egg nature of algorithms. He comments on some of the biases that we read about over the last few weeks. He says that we're basically trying to solve soft science issues with hard science logic. That's a great way of putting it. And this approach, he says, appears to be no more effective at trying to eliminate human biases from incarceration penalties than allowing overzealous prosecutors, hypocritical judicial deities, or overworked social workers to flip a coin. Another great phrase. There are just some human interactions that require truly human-based inferences based on experience, research, and plain old gut feelings. And I think we can generally agree with that. But at the same time, it's the gut feelings that made algorithms so attractive to people. Getting rid of that subjective gut feeling about someone, because those gut feelings can often grow out of bias and racism and other sort of discriminatory feelings people have towards someone else based on how they look, not just skin color, but just the kind of clothes they wear, the kind of car they drive, or how they speak, or how they don't speak, or the kinds of words they use, right? Not just the diction and so on. And so the so-called objective algorithm comes to the rescue of rescuing us from ourselves, right? We can be better humans by being less human in a way and outsourcing these decisions to algorithms. But of course, now we've been reading about sort of the different kinds of inequalities and structural issues that get sort of reified through algorithms and in fact intensified. Should we have an appeal process to ensure human interaction? A sort of common question that many of you asked across the couple weeks. How do we do this? Again, one of the reasons we implemented and we like algorithms in the first place, besides efficiency and scale and so on, is to avoid the problems of human interaction. Another interesting way of thinking about human engagement is how much of human interaction with an algorithm should be just part of the algorithm itself, rather than some sort of external direction or oversight. And this is, I think, a great question also from Natalie, because it gets to the subjective, objective reason we have algorithms in the first place. Can there ever be a discrete criteria that can govern human inputs? Can there ever be a clear case where someone it gets flagged. You need to look at this algorithm, or this might be wrong. Can you ever really decide that within the context of an algorithm? Can a fish ever recognize that it's swimming in water? How do you understand that awareness? So there's a practical issue here of how do you implement any kind of meaningful human interaction that doesn't defeat the point of the algorithm. But there's also the philosophical question, or maybe ethical question, of what are you trying to accomplish with the algorithms? I mentioned before, you get to create a world that you think should exist by implementing algorithms in some kind of way, whether you're a government or a big corporation or even a small business. You get to sort of help shape the world in your vision by the sort of automated decision-making process you use. And human action doesn't scale very well, right? Human intervention in an algorithmic process doesn't scale very well. Shouldn't our efforts at improving algorithms be put towards improving the algorithmic sort of ecosystem and the inputs it's getting, and understand, how that data came to exist in the first place? I don't know. I don't have the answer, but it's a very interesting philosophical question of where do you put efforts to improve algorithms? Do you put it in sort of deliberate intervention, or do you try to step back and sort of work more at the margins of where algorithms exist in the first place? I'd say the most common theme, or the biggest theme of questions that you asked across the few weeks, was variations on the question of now what? How can we be more aware of the impact of everyday algorithms? Can algorithmic systems actually reduce bias? Is this even possible? How do we fix the negative impacts? How do we prevent or mitigate social harms? Do the theoretical advantages like efficiency outweigh the practical, the known problems with biases that we've seen over the few weeks? And so a couple ideas that sort of really aren't from the readings, but just kind of my general sense of how people have approached this. One approach that I think is useful to keep in mind is just rejecting the notion of algorithms as a threat. I talked about this before in terms of the algocracy article. We don't need to be afraid of algorithms. We don't need to be afraid of artificial decision-making processes. And many of the articles, not so much the ones we read for this class, but you can imagine it's really easy to have articles that are especially for a wider audience saying we need to be concerned about this. We're losing control of our world. We're going to be governed by Skynet really soon. We can treat it as a threat, but as I talked about in the case of literacy, it's part of the ecosystem that we live in. Just like we manage, beavers and wolves and other insects and ourselves to some extent, we need to manage it. It's just part of life, rather than something we have to actively resist or push back or something like that. Doesn't mean that there's no work to be done, obviously. But we're human. Our decisions are always going to be imperfect. Our algorithms are always going to be imperfect. But to recognize algorithms like literacy, they mediate our relationships between each other and the world, and that's not going to change. So the question is sort of where and how do we remediate these processes, remedy these processes as we see them unfolding. I also want to suggest this is not a matter of supervising algorithms. We see that phrase a lot in this kind of literature. We need more human supervision of algorithms, like you're supervising your kids on the playground or something, just kind of keeping an eye on it to make sure nobody's doing grave harm to someone else. I think that's a really misleading metaphor, because there's no clear places. I mentioned a second ago, there's no clear places where people need to know they intervene, like supervising kids on a playground. It's clear if somebody's about to fall off and break their neck, right? Or if somebody's trying to rip somebody's face off, which happens more than you might guess. There's no clear place in a sort of an algorithm systems that's meant to be self-sufficient where somebody needs to go in and do something. And again, scale is a real issue. It's also very helpful on the same question to think about micro and macro levels. Where is an algorithm supposed to work? Right? Is it supposed to? Where do you intervene? Think about the racial or the criminal justice article we read about sort of paroles and prison sentences and so on. If you look at the individual cases, one by one, and they look at it and compare it to other things and say, look, this didn't really make sense in the end, right? Hindsight is 20/20. But if you looked at those individual cases at the time, they made sense. Like, we can go back and say that was probably the wrong decision. But at the time, they made perfect sense. There was no reason that anyone would have gone into any of those cases that they flagged as being sort of egregiously wrong, ultimately, there's no reason at the time when those decisions were being made that you would have necessarily said, oh, this is completely wrong. Now, you may have disagreed with the philosophies behind the judgments and so on. That's a different thing. But in terms of just looking at the decision that was made based on the available data, it was reasonable. It certainly wouldn't have been flagged by any algorithmic process as needing remediation or needing human intervention. At a macro level, as the article I think really nicely demonstrates, there's clearly a disparity that needs to be addressed. But how do you do that? How do you implement it? How do you know if you're fixing it? Because the problem is so big, right? Complex ecosystems. How do you manage a very large system when you can only start really by managing a much smaller segment of it? And to me, this is where the theoretical challenges of complex systems and algorithms and so on is so fascinating, because it's an interesting combination of sort of social control and social engineering and statistics and human emotion and intelligence and history and all these different economics, all these different variables, risk assessment that go into creating this sort of straightforward, discrete system that takes account into this tremendous complexity. But there's a whole field of study, complexity studies, systems analysis. They do this all the time. So to what extent can you apply this to the kinds of things that we've seen in the last few weeks where there's sort of some discrepancies? Danaher, in his article, gave a few potential solutions. A number of you asked my opinion on them, and I don't have much to say about it because I don't find a lot of value in his solutions. The reason I wanted us to read them is because I think they're really interesting archetypal solutions. They're very broad philosophical categories of solutions. So he talks about surveillance, like sous chef, under chef, the surveillance, looking at things from below, holding people accountable that way. He talks about independent archives, integration with algorithms. I've been talking about that the last few minutes. But the devil is in the details. And he's talking about these broad archetypal categories, and he kind of refutes them and suggests that they wouldn't necessarily be super useful. But the question really is, how much of each of these do you implement in different situations, given the inputs and the outputs that you're trying to get out? And we really need to think much more in terms of ecosystems, as the Caswell and Wilson articles were trying to get us to think, rather than how do we engage with algorithms in a very specific way, because that's, to me, not going to be useful. I should have asked you to write more particularly about his solutions, because I think they're interesting from a sort of a very broad overview perspective. But when you think about sort of what is this really going to get us in the end, it's not much. And that's what he concludes, but he really could have had much sort of finer grained analysis in terms of how he thought these things could be actually implemented. But you have to have a balance of sort of theoretical stuff and then practical, like case studies. I'm hoping we get more of that kind of case study stuff as well. If you're frustrated there aren't more practical solutions in these articles, I'm with you. Like that's the nature of the field. The field is very heavy on criticism. Data studies, algorithmic studies, critical big data studies, they're all very heavy on critique and very low on solutions. And I think that's okay for now. It's understandable. These are all relatively new fields. And it hasn't, it's not that people have never thought critically about algorithms or data before now. But as a field of study where people are approaching it from lots of disciplinary angles, economics and political science, and obviously computer science and statistics, but also different kind of social science angles, historical angles. When you bring all these things together, you have a very different way of critiquing algorithms and data than you did even 10 years ago, but especially 20. I mean, the idea of sort of a society governed by data is a relatively new thing in terms of how we think about it and how we critique it and how we respond and make changes in the world. So this gets us to the last point I want to make. One of the most common themes that link the articles, but much more implicitly than explicitly, I hope they're trying to get us to think about transparency and accountability in terms of algorithms. Words that are mentioned in many of the articles, but I don't think fleshed out particularly well, so I just want to conclude with a point about those. All the articles, I think, are really driving at the question of what are the practical levels of transparency and accountability that we can have in algorithms. Now, full algorithmic transparency, we can hope for that. We'll never get it. It's like they're trade secrets, right? There's no way people, companies, governments are going to sort of publish the mathematical formula for things to be computed, because then people can easily game the system and so on. In industry, they are trade secrets. That's part of their intellectual property, right? It's kind of like natural flavors when you see that on the side of a box. There's no definition of natural. It means absolutely nothing. So that's just a way of not having to say all the chemicals that go into it to make your food not like gray, because that's what it looks like when you put a lot of preservatives and stuff. You're never going to have full transparency, but how much can be required, right? There is an amount that can be required, just like we have nutritional information to some extent that tells us, at least theoretically, what's in the box. How much is constitutional? Where does individual or sort of even corporate privacy come into play? Who gets the power to intervene in algorithmic decisions? Have you ever heard anyone tell you, the system won't let me do that? You're talking to someone, customer service, right, or email, like, I can't do this. Like, I want to help you, but the system won't let me do it, right? There's a reason they can't do that. That's by design. It's not an accident that they don't have access. The people who are dealing with actual human beings, right, and may have gut instincts about, this person's a good person, I want to help them, I'll override this thing. They are deliberately not able to do that. The system, the algorithm, is seen as more trustworthy and more reliable and more consistent than humans making individual decisions about other humans, right? That's part of the algorithmic world. The people who deal with other people and have the most control over their lives, in a way, have the least amount of control over the system that they're working within. Accountability. So accountability and transparency are the two themes I want to highlight here. Accountability, I'm not going to talk about at all, because within a government or corporation, it's very tricky to sort of mandate to have accountability. And I don't think you can have any accountability without transparency. So I'm just going to focus on transparency now, because we don't have a lot of that. When it comes to government regulation, I'm a minimalist. I want the least amount of government regulation. But the amount is clearly not zero, and it's clearly not that close to zero either. If you look historically of why do we have government regulation, and you see what things were going on that led to different kinds of government regulation, you can understand why we have it. You can't just trust that people are going to be honest and people work for consumers' benefit. I mean, yeah, you can believe in the invisible hand of capitalism, but it also smacks people around pretty regularly. There's a reason we have government regulation, and I think we have some that's a good model. Okay, we have credit scores, right? We all are subject to credit scores. There's a lot of regulation about how people can see how their scores are being computed. You don't get the exact formula, but you can see what factors, what data is on your credit report. Companies have to disclose sort of how much they're weighing these different factors. Again, not exactly, but they have to give you some indication. There's a lot of regulation that dictates how credit scores get computed and how much consumers can know about their own credit. And I think that's a beacon of hope for the other algorithmic systems that we are subjected to, because that has been a success. That hasn't been a burdensome regulation, because that's the big fear of government regulation. It becomes harder for businesses to actually do anything because they're so busy dealing with regulations. But this is a case where it's worked well for consumers and for people who use the credit scores as well. How can we have that with the other kinds of algorithmic ecosystems that we're subjected to? So there is hope. I'm not sure how to implement it, obviously, but there is something like that. For government systems, I think algorithms could work a lot like community development plans, right? The city owns land and they want to do something with it. They get proposals. They make selections based on cost and so on. They put it before the public. There's forums, there's meetings, there's argument, there's productive debate, there's unproductive debate too. But you get a lot of different voices, and people who are deliberately, affected or most obviously affected by this thing get to weigh in on it, right? And that goes into the final decision. And that kind of long process, which takes years, right? And makes government bureaucracy look terrible. But that actually deliberate approach can be very useful. And I think that's potentially a way forward with different kinds of algorithms that we use too. What if people got to sort of weigh in on how these decisions get made? Because then you get a lot more critique as well, right? From academics, from people who do critical data studies, from different points of view, and saying, this isn't going to work for me because I don't fit the standard input that you're expecting in the algorithm. This doesn't work for me because I come from a social background that didn't allow me to get to, a certain level of consideration. That's not my fault. I'm doing everything I can. Why can't I get a different algorithm for my situation? Right? When you get that kind of conversation, I think we're going to have a much better sort of algorithmic world around us. For private systems, we're not going to have that sort of back and forth, obviously. But my hope is that more awareness about sort of what the issues are, and not just the fact that algorithms can, perpetuate social inequality. I think you've all sort of got that, and you probably sort of recognize that even before this course. But to understand sort of the different ways we can think about it, the different ways we need to think about it. And a lot of these are totally contradictory, and there's no clear right answer, there's no clear path forward. But awareness, I think, is the first step towards any kind of improvement. So I hope you all feel a little bit more aware of what some of the key issues and challenges are, even if we don't have great solutions just yet. Talk to you later.